So it's 1 o'clock this Friday afternoon on the 29th of October, 2021. And welcome to our panel discussion here and our presentation. There's four of us presenters today. And as you can see, this program is back in the game, assessing the United States re-engagement in the Paris Agreement and climate governance. And we will just wait for just a couple of minutes before we get started on that. So, but without maybe elevator music, that seemed to be pretty loud. But thank you first of all to all the panelists for joining us again this year. It's exciting to be here. So to the other presenters, if you have PowerPoint slides, you know, as from last year, you can show your slides by sharing your screen. I presume you know how that works. But if not, you have to have your PowerPoint started in the background, your slides ready. And so when it's your turn to speak, you could simply do share screen at the bottom, and then the Microsoft Word or the PowerPoint slides will then be shown. But yes, again, without further ado, it's past 1 o'clock. So let's just get started with back in the game, assessing the United States re-engagement in the Paris Agreement and climate governance, and what questions may lead from that. It's a huge honor for me to have with me Carolina Arolita, and she is a visiting assistant professor at the University of Oklahoma College of Law, and she and I are co-chairs of this particular interest group section. So thank you to Professor Arolita for joining us. We also have with us Charlotte Koo, who is the professor of law and director of global programs for the Texas A&M School of Law. And of course, when you present in this order in which I'm introducing you, if you want to take a moment or two to introduce yourselves a little more than what I'm doing, that obviously is fine too. But in general, as you know, you'll have about 1 or 2 minutes, or rather about 12 minutes to your presentations. So that should be taken out of that time. We also have with us Albert Lin, who is a professor of law with the University of California Davis School of Law. We have Tade Oyewunmi, who is a visiting assistant professor of law at the University of Oregon School of Law, where he teaches energy and international transactions, sustainable business law, and air pollution. His research and teaching interests include oil and gas law and policy and international investment law. Tade co-edited the Handbook on Decarbonization and the Energy Industry, and he's also the author of the book titled Regulating Gas Supply to Power Markets. And finally, last but not least, here I am. I'm a full professor of law and a Fulbright Scholar in Climate Change Law and Policy with the University of South Dakota School of Law. Where I have just given notice and will terminate my position in about 3 weeks from now. So after that, I'll be working for a very large foundation funded by a wealthy individual who wishes to donate all his money and is going to try to seek private solutions and governmental solutions to climate change around the world and poverty. So I was happy and honored to be handpicked to come and serve in that role. And I will be honest, I'm also glad to not be serving in such a politically conservative part of the nation as the one I'm in right now. So good changes ahead, hopefully for all of us. There's a chat function too, but without further ado, I'll be reading that as I think Carolina, if you would like to start, that'd be great.
Thank you, Mariana, for such a general introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you all, my fellow panelists. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm choosing today to discuss one particular feature of this addressing the re-engagement of the US when it comes to climate change, and it's called the topic of today's presentation on my end. It's the case for United States climate leadership in bridging the gap between developing and developed countries. This, of course, speaks a topic that speaks just to my heart, living and teaching in Oklahoma and also being a Brazilian. So before we move further, I would like to call attention for some of charts. So this is basically the increase in global temperature This is another way to show such an increase, comparing the time difference between 1981 and 2010 and 2020. So the redder you are, the warmer we are. So quite interestingly. And this slide is one that I want to discuss a bit more, because that shows the increase of carbon dioxide emissions and how the tendency is always to increase. And the only time we have some disruption in this chart, and this is obviously from the Global Carbon Project, that you have the reference at the top. They haven't updated from 2021, but we know the emissions are, of course, coming back after COVID, well, not technically after, but despite COVID, I should say. So we only have disruptions when we have the oil crisis, let's say 1972, 1979, or the collapse of the former Soviet Union, early 1989, early 1990s, or the crisis of 2008 and so forward. So I think that's helpful to illustrate that it's difficult to have countries coming on board and agreeing on carbon to reduce greenhouse gas emissions generally, but of course carbon dioxide specifically. And that speaks also to the tragedy, the so-called tragedy of the commons. If we keep polluting, we'll end up having nothing. So our Earth, as we know it, will be gone. And that's not me telling. We have the IPCC report this year and other reports that I'll mention momentarily. That also speaks to the complexity of climate change, and I think it's particularly helpful to cite Giddens, because it not only addresses discounting and our own bias with regard to the future, we tend to pursue present rewards, but he addresses from a political perspective and how democratic elections are to some degree skewed for this short-term rewards for politicians. So that makes it domestically harder to get countries to agree on on having greenhouse gases emissions. And of course, climate change is a quintessential global scale collective action problem. And I'm only one of the others that have been approaching that from this perspective. It is a collective action problem to the extent that we need everybody on board to have this solution. And the incentives for countries actually to agree on meaningful reductions on greenhouse gases are skewed. And why is that? Because if you, as a nation, decide to keep polluting, that pollution, of course, will cause harms domestically, but it will be spread out. It's transboundary by its own nature. Hence also the Hutton's piece quote above. The same, if you decide to be very environmental friendly, mitigate your own greenhouse gas emissions, the benefits will be not only for you, but also to the global commons. So in that sense, there are not, the incentives for free riding are abundant. And that shows us, and this is a former cartoon from an exam question from mine in my international energy law course. So there seems to be an unanimous agreement amongst world leaders that every country, apart from their own, needs to do much more to save the planet. And this is something that is so clear, and it speaks to the challenges, and hopefully it's easier for you to perceive in terms of how we keep saying that everybody else needs to reduce the greenhouse emissions, but we our own, or we always try to, we meaning pick up your favorite country, we always tend to find exceptions. And about those exceptions that I want to discuss, because developing countries specifically tend to pledge for such exceptions, or for longer term to go carbon neutral, or to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So let's talk about the Paris Agreement. On your right, on the PowerPoint, you have the three key elements. Of course, the limit of the temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, ultimately to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the so-called national determined contributions that are not mandatory. Countries decide and commit their own, they're mandatory in terms of their own procedure, but not the target itself. So every 5 years, countries have to share the information, and each national determined contribution is more ambitious than the next one. And of course, the need for climate finance to developing countries, something that is at the forefront of the Conference of the Parties 26. So legal framework of the Paris Agreement, we have top down this decision of all countries that we need to have greenhouse gas emissions, but also bottom up the so-called national determined contributions. I want to focus our discussion in the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, to the extent that that's the legal principle and Article 4 of the Paris Agreement that countries, developing countries, pledge to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, but also to do it with a time break in a less immediate way, and the degree of such reduction being smaller, at least that how has been portrayed. I want to focus our discussion with the so-called basic countries: Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. I'm not talking about the BRICS. I think Russia is not a developing country for all sorts of reasons. I understand this can be controversial, but I want to focus on the basic countries. They have negotiating climate agreements en bloc, and I think it makes a lot of sense. And I want to they have been signatory and actually effective, ratified the Paris Agreement earlier than 2016. Russia only ratified 2019, so there's a lot of discrepancies there. So that's what I want to focus and bring as in block. So what the so-called basic countries have been saying in terms of arguments for pushing on the Article 4, the principle of differentiated but common responsibilities and capabilities. Well, they are not historically responsible for the current levels of saturation. They need to secure economic growth because it's too costly to go green. And this notion that poverty pollutes, so first they need to grow, and then they will think about the sustainable part of sustainable development, the social capital, the potential climate justice part. And let's look at the data for a second. And the importance of the US leadership is not only to bring peer pressure and reciprocity, but from a historical account, there is merit to the argument, to the extent that the US, and the data is up to 2018 from our World in Data, tell us that the US holds 1/4 of the current pollution that we have when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions. So 25% is a lot. If you're comparing it with China, 12.7. If you were comparing to India, 3%. So again, the so-called villains today are not, at least for the historical part, they are not that with the responsibility part. When you look at emissions per capita, that's one way also that we need the US leadership, because it's top. So historically, the US has been the top emitter. And also when we look at per capita data, meaning per habitant, it's significantly different than most basic countries, specifically India and China. So the importance of transitioning to green energy sources. Has been a lot of talk about natural gas, which is only a transitional fuel. I really think this slide is important to the extent that it shows us that the coal bituminous, the most used coal in the US, is significantly more polluting than natural gas. So obviously natural gas to energy source transition, it's not clean, so emphasis on renewable that it's needed. So how can the US bridge the gap with reciprocity, with calling everybody? It has economic power, it has leverage on the table. So there's no room for free riding approach, meaning from the US not being in the Paris Agreement. And under the current administration, there has been a significant move on that. Not only the US is a member now of the Paris Agreement, but also committed to significant reductions. And that will help galvanize climate action, bridging that gap between developing and developing nations, specifically when it comes to the basic countries, in the wake of the Conference of the Parties that is starting this Sunday, and specifically with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement with the market mechanisms. When you look at the climate action tracker, the US used to be critically insufficient outside the Paris Agreement. Now it is still insufficient, but I think it's helpful to see that the recent national determined contributions for the countries that submitted are not that significant. So we need US leadership again. We are heading to a super warm world according to the climate action tracker. So 2.9. If you're taking pledges and targets, which will be addressed later with the carbon zero, slightly better, 2.4. Last week's report of the United Nations Environmental Program, the hit is on: a world of climate promises not yet delivered. I love that, not yet delivered. We still keep seeing, we still keep discussing. So the world is, and this according to the United Nations Environmental Program, we are on track for 2.7 degrees Celsius So we're still warming a lot and quite fast. So catastrophic changes, and they are emphatically calling all countries to halve annual greenhouse emissions, and they give us a deadline. We have 8 years, so there's no controversy on that. So no longer a decade. So there's all those pledges about going carbon neutral by 2050. We need to review that as soon as possible. So summing up this presentation, US leadership is crucial, of course, for global meaningful greenhouse gas reduction. The need for the US to be on board with the economic leverage to bring reciprocity and peer pressure. We cannot have holdouts. China, Brazil, India, they need to commit, the same with South Africa. And that will hopefully create a virtuous cycle, a race to the top, where everybody's actually investing in green energy and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The US can share its own policies, let's say cost benefit analysis, their use, and that's methodology that I also research. It can also help sharing technology to steer such an energy transition. Importantly, the climate financing under the Green Climate Fund, that it's also forthcoming discussion in the Conference of the Parties starting on Sunday. We need that financing part to bring developing world, specifically basic countries, on board to halve their emissions. So the United States will become more powerful if you think about international leadership, and that will have spillover effects that are not necessarily just for carbon emissions, but it fosters human dignity. We're already seeing that. Less than a month ago, we have the human dignity, the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment being recognized by the UN. So that's a major point, major achievement. The US was more active than it has been in previous administrations. And important here, China, India, and Japan, China, India, Japan and Russia, specifically for developing nations, China and India did not oppose. So again, we see a sea change on that. And specifically when we talk about spillover effects, the United States will gain, is estimated to gain $2 trillion just by world global climate action by 2030. So there's a lot of money on the table. It's benefit. It's in the US interest leadership financially as well to have everybody else curbing their greenhouse gas emissions, hence the need to be on board. So in conclusion, the United States leadership increases the likelihood of the basic countries and ultimately the developing world to increase the commitment to halve greenhouse gas emissions. And we have a short window of opportunity for action. The United Nations Environment Program has spoken. We had 8 years. That's where the science also with the different scenarios of the IPCC report released this summer is also leading us depending on the scenarios. So thank you very much for your generous audience. I look forward to your questions.
Oops, I had muted myself. Thank you so much, Carolina, and very interesting, of course, and scary at the same time. I do suggest, though, that we hold all questions until the end so that all 4 of us present. I don't have, my presentation is shorter towards the end, but so that the audience can ask questions at the end of this. And for the technology people, I presume people can submit questions via chat or that I could unmute them, but via chat, I think would be the best way of doing it later on. But for right now, let's move on to the next presenter, which is Charlotte Koo. Professor Koo, would you like to continue?
Well, thank you, Mariana, and thank you, Carolina, for organizing this, and Mariana for your chairing of this panel. What I'd like to do is just sort of talk about the U.S. and what's going on in the U.S. right now as we re-engage. So I think as all of us on this panel, and certainly those in the audience know, that the formal re-engagement of the U.S. with the international climate governance regime took place as soon as President Biden took office on the 20th of January, 2021. So he signed an executive order explicitly reversing the actions taken by the Trump administration to block implementation of plans to meet U.S. obligations under the Paris Climate Agreement. And so President Biden took measures to assess what those actions were and essentially to try to reverse those. On the 27th of January, President Biden signed an additional executive order, which also explicitly signed an additional submission deposit an instrument of acceptance to rejoin the Paris Agreement. So it further committed the U.S. to work towards the agreement's 3 objectives and provided funds. So we are formally re-engaging, and of course the president's on his way to the summit in Glasgow, even as we speak. So that is good news. But there was a cost to the disengagement, and I would commend those who haven't seen it, Professor Arlotta's very good piece on in the Pennsylvania Journal of International Law about the cost-benefit analysis of the Trump withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, which sort of confused the situation such that there might be litigation, so that you're increasing actually the cost, you're providing distractions to what should be a more focused attention to meeting these goals. And perhaps most seriously, it begins to erode credibility and confidence in the institutions of the United States, both at home and abroad, with regard to commitment to engaging in these climate activities. And this is, at a time when confidence in public institutions is already at an all-time low. So one hardly needs, further erosion of that, and particularly where you need internal leadership, never mind the sort of leadership that Carolina was just talking about. So there are some enduring costs to our withdrawal, even though we're trying to get back into the game. But the U.S. Today, getting back into all of this, is also not the U.S. of 2017. And there are 2 areas that I'll just like to focus on in my few minutes for consideration. One is there has been a substantial increase in the level of subnational activity. So this is activity at the state and local level. I note the 3 of us are actually on the West Coast of the United States right now. And so we are in areas where it is a little more active out here than perhaps some other parts of the country. But nonetheless, I think worth taking note of. On the more headline grabbing side, you may recall that in June 2017, President Xi Jinping of China, hosting the Under-2 Clean Energy Forum, made a fairly big deal of welcoming California Governor Jerry Brown, almost as an equal, onto a stage to sort of talk about ongoing U.S. engagement with climate change. It's noteworthy that the U.S. Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry, was in fact in attendance at that conference, but was not given the profile that the governor of California was, in part because China very much wanted to advance and continue pursuing Paris Agreement objectives and not kind of discuss the alternatives. Beyond these headlines, California had already been a leader in concluding agreements with the equivalent of states and municipalities around the world, and with the German land of Baden-Württemberg had pioneered the Under-2 coalition that started in 2015, that today is made up of 260 subnational jurisdictions that are states, municipalities, regional organizations, which according to their information represent about 1.75 billion people and 50% of the world's economy. There are also corporations and civil society represented in this, but I think it's interesting that there was effort to build sort of a network of public jurisdictions that at the subnational level to try to engage with some of these issues. Because at the high policy level, certainly there need to be initiatives taken, funds provided. But in so many ways, climate change is an issue that very much has to be action oriented, and a lot of this needs to be at the local level. The way this coalition works is jurisdictions interested in joining sign a memorandum of understanding, basically committing to take steps to keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees and preferably at 1.5 degrees. 35 of member jurisdictions have reported plans to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Now, this does focus on urban centers. And so, one might think, there are parts of the world that are left out. Now, some other numbers on the subnational activity. Between 2008 and 2021, U.S. jurisdictions signed some 96 bilateral agreements with foreign counterparts. Interesting that the jurisdictions do not necessarily sign agreements with jurisdictions the same size on the other end. You could be a municipality signing with a country, or you could be a municipality with a municipality, or you could be a municipality with a utility authority, something like this. So the key is that you actually have an agreement to undertake a certain level of work. California as a state was a leader with 84 agreements, with other US states joining at about the rate of 12 agreements during this between 2008 and 2021. Between May and July 2021 alone, though, and this is sort of interesting, overtures were made by foreign jurisdictions to 54 US jurisdictions. So I think, you know, the idea here is that you actually have opportunities to engage, and I think foreign counterparts are seeking out US jurisdictions as appropriate. Most of these overtures came from China and from the EU. The EU has quite a concerted program underway to engage at the subnational level, and there's a funding that goes with that. And a wider review of these agreements shows that there was kind of a peak in the establishing of subnational engagement in the years between Kyoto and Paris. So this was, you know, a gap filler of some kind. So it's a complementary type of activity. So 9 US states have active agreements with 12 European countries, and including municipalities. The cooperation is usually expressed in a variety of forms: memorandum of understanding, joint declaration, letters of intent, letters of cooperation, collaboration agreements, cooperation agreements, working agreements. They're fairly simple. Most of them will be very explicit about financial obligations and liabilities, but they sort of spell out what it is that the parties are endeavoring to engage in. It is interesting that of the agreements signed, there's a higher level of inactive agreements amongst those signed with China than with the European jurisdictions. Some of this has to do with specificity. If you look at the European agreements, you'll see they're talking about very specific things that the jurisdictions are actually engaged in with each other: knowledge sharing, technology development, experiences in particular energy sectors like wind and solar, zero emission vehicles, and so forth. So the more specific the topic is, the more likely it will stay in place and actually move things along. This, in some ways, is interesting and to be celebrated. The danger, of course, is it's quite piecemeal, and it adds to the fragmentation in climate governance and action. So efforts could benefit, I think, from national coordination and added resources, but it can at least be recognized as an important complement to the existing international agreements and framework. And I think it raises interesting international law questions on how to fold the fragmentation created by these diverse multilateral activities into a broader international system without taking away from the dynamism and involvement of the millions of people who really are at the front lines of climate change. So in some ways, this is all should be something to be celebrated, because after all, international law being taken care of at the local level, and my goodness, this is, you know, a dream for international law folks. But on the other hand, it does create some challenges. The other thing I'd like to note is the enduring and ongoing engagement by the US military, actually, in climate change, in the climate change area. The US military actually had flagged climate change as a source of security threat, as a security multiplier since the 1980s. The initial focus was on disruptions to societies that climate change could cause: migration, resource scarcity, diseases. The US military is heavily engaged in humanitarian relief efforts around the world. So when you have major weather events, the US military is often out there with the hospital ship Comfort and so forth. And so, you know, there are resources set aside to be deployed in those kinds of circumstances. And the military, as I'm sure everyone knows, has a very long planning lead time. And so for quite a long time has realized that they probably needed to put in more resources in these areas than they otherwise had, simply because the demand was going to be there. On the other hand, in a time when there may be constraints to resources, you're also taking away from other things that the military might be potentially working on. So some choices are being made. So that was the initial focus. But the focus now, certainly since the beginning of 2000, has been on how climate change affects operational readiness and efficiency of the US forces themselves. If we think of where military installations are located, port facilities and the like, many of them are actually seeing the vulnerabilities of their own installations. It seems almost harking back to the 18th and 19th centuries, where you read about the Navy concerned about access to fresh water supplies at ports of call. But yet, these are things that they have to face. Of course, there are strategic considerations as the Arctic, the geographic form, physical form of the Arctic changes, but also the effects of drought and desertification, thawing permafrost on US installations and ability to function in the environments that they had been planning to do. So you'll see increasingly, and this continued even through the Trump administration, that in training and planning, climate change is very much factored in. And military forces are well oriented to trying to deal with these things, at least within some operational range. I'll just end on just a few general thoughts about implications for international law. I think as I said, I think the news is generally good that you've got more individuals, more jurisdictions, more resources being drawn into a system to work towards meeting specific international obligations, but it is an environment in which we're not accustomed to working. So the challenge is to recognize the effort and to orchestrate resource allocation and impact. Municipalities can demonstrate their willingness and ability to learn from counterparts around the world, but they ultimately still need resources to implement their plans. And I think Carolina's presentation notes that there remains a gap between those who have and those who have less, and somehow that needs to be addressed in some manner, and it does probably have to be done at a higher level than where local folks normally can generate their own resources. There's coordination, levering of the seeds that might be planted on the ground, but these have also to be then raised to some level of national recognition and coordination for efficient ongoing development. So I think the main international law and governance question is really how to factor in these activities in a way that allows for adequate structure, but also not so much structure as to constrain the dynamism that's actually happening on the ground, which I think is also quite important. So it is really for international lawyers, and particularly those who think about these things more conceptually, perhaps, to visualize a sense of a concept that can embody all of the activity, but in a framework that actually can efficiently use the resources and the energy that's being put into it. And the work, I think, is reasonably urgent in order to address the very striking needs that we face in this area today. So I think with that, thanks, Miana.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate that, as does the audience, I'm sure. And with that, we'll move on to Albert Lin.
Great. Well, thank you, Carolina and Miana, for organizing this panel. I'm going to be talking about net zero targets. And in the past year or so, net zero pledges have become all the rage in climate policy. Dozens of countries representing over half of all greenhouse gas emissions globally have pledged to achieve net zero. Over 3,000 corporations have done the same, including many of the world's best known brands. Net zero targets can take the form of firm commitments and binding laws, or aspirational statements and non-binding policies. Serious questions surround these pledges. Why are so many countries and businesses doing this? How will these pledges be achieved? And how can society help ensure that these pledges are more than greenwashing? So I propose two strategies for trying to ensure that net zero pledges matter. First, society should develop and implement transparency, accountability, and enforcement mechanisms to promote follow-through on net zero commitments. Second, net zero pledges should incorporate distinct targets for carbon mitigation and carbon removal. Before elaborating on these strategies, I first offer an overview of net zero targets and motivations for their adoption. So There's a lot of variation in net zero targets. There's variation with respect to target dates. Some talk about 2035, 2040, 2050, 2060. There's variation in terms of intended reliance on offsets, that is carbon reduction from outside a company or outside a jurisdiction's borders. There's variation in terms of the greenhouse gases that are covered. Some cover all greenhouse gases, some cover only carbon dioxide. And perhaps most importantly, there's variation in terms of the scope of emissions covered, particularly this question of whether a company's net zero pledge includes upstream or downstream emissions. Chevron provides a nice example. Their net zero pledge does not cover what's referred to as scope 3 emissions, that is downstream emissions associated with burning Chevron's products, which of course are the bulk of emissions associated with Chevron's activities. Net zero pledges tend to offer relatively little detail. So if we turn to government pledges, we have a range of government pledges, few of which are actually found in binding law. The US, for example, through President Biden, has stated its intent to achieve net zero by the year 2050, but not a lot of detail regarding how to get there. And we see a similar lack of detail in corporate net zero pledges as well. Corporate net zero pledges, of course, are voluntary and are quite skeletal, including in terms of the extent to which these companies tend to rely on carbon removal. So by carbon removal, some intend to rely on nature-based sorts of carbon removal, such as planting trees, afforestation, or soil carbon sequestration. A few companies have talked specifically about engineered carbon removal. And by engineered carbon removal, we're talking about things like what's referred to on this diagram as BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, where you grow bioenergy crops, you burn them for fuel, you capture the carbon, and then you sequester it underground, or direct air capture using chemical processes to try to capture carbon directly from the atmosphere. Note that these engineered carbon technologies are not ready for prime time. They are largely in the development or pilot project sort of stage where there's way too expensive to be applied on a practical widespread scale at this point. So will net zero pledges matter? To get at this question, we can at least briefly think about some of the underlying motivations for making these pledges. With respect to private pledges, in some instances, the implementation of these pledges can increase profits. They can make economic sense. For example, measures to increase energy efficiency can save a company money and also decrease greenhouse gas emissions. There are other potential less direct economic benefits that a company might get in terms of improved reputation, boosting employee morale, improving the long-term strategic position of a company. But there are reasons to worry, too, that net zero targets could serve as greenwashing, particularly given the nature of these targets. They're far off, they're general. We're talking about, okay, we're going to achieve this 20 or 30 years from now. How likely is it that a company is going to be held responsible for not achieving these targets that they're making these pledges about today? And then, as I've already suggested, the net zero concept is somewhat manipulable. Right? If you exclude downstream emissions, for example, you can make this pledge and look good for it without necessarily making much of a difference in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. For government pledges too, we can think about underlying motivations. In some instances, there might be a revenue generation or at least reducing government expenditures through the implementation of these pledges. For example, if you had carbon taxes that would generate revenue, or reductions in fossil fuel subsidies that would save money for the government. These sorts of government pledges also can guide policymaking. They can provide certainty to businesses and investors. They can offer benefits for a country if it helps the country to be a first mover in a particular market for renewable energy technologies, for example. None of these motivations guarantee that net zero pledges will be honored, but they do suggest that these pledges may be more than just empty promises. But how can society make sure that these net zero targets matter? And so here, I basically advocate these two strategies. That first, we should try to reinforce net zero targets. And that second, net zero targets in their design should distinguish between mitigating emissions, that is reducing emissions, and trying to remove carbon from the atmosphere. First, in terms of reinforcing net zero targets. For private net zero targets, it's critical that there be transparency and verification. There are important initiatives going on in this area. Just yesterday, the Science Based Targets Initiative released standards and guidance to assist companies in developing net zero targets. The Securities and Exchange Commission is developing a rule on climate-related disclosures. It's unclear the extent to which the rule will directly address net zero targets, though they certainly could. In terms of enforcing net zero targets, enforcement is a little bit strange to talk about, where we're talking about, for example, voluntary targets by companies. Nonetheless, there are mechanisms that may be useful in trying to indirectly, bring a stick to try to compel companies to actually follow through on these pledges. So, for example, securities fraud litigation might be an option, particularly depending on the content of the forthcoming SEC rule. Perhaps statements by companies with regards to net zero targets could be arguably held to be violating SEC mandates to make climate-related disclosures if those statements turn out to be fraudulent. We can also look to consumer protection law. The Federal Trade Commission Act prohibits unfair or deceptive practices. And so just a few months ago, Greenpeace and other groups filed a complaint with the FTC alleging overstatements by Chevron regarding its commitments to decrease fossil fuel pollution violated the statute. Similarly, state consumer protection laws might be available. Contract law might also provide some useful tools for enforcement. Already we see a growth in the use of sustainability-linked bonds, where the interest rate on bonds is linked to companies' performance in achieving sustainability goals. Another mechanism of contract law that might be useful is just settlements of litigation, where you have violations alleged of environmental laws or some of the public nuisance climate change litigation we're seeing. We can imagine settlements incorporating requirements that companies actually implement some of the steps needed to ultimately achieve net zero. And we shouldn't forget that investors can be a potentially important enforcement mechanism as well. Many major banks and large investment managers, such as BlackRock, have made net zero pledges, and those pledges include their lending activities. So they could enforce those targets made by other companies by refusing to lend to companies that aren't on track to achieve net zero. With respect to government targets, one can imagine that it would be difficult to enforce any target that the federal government in the United States might make, even if the federal government were to adopt one legally. But in other countries, perhaps there are better prospects for trying to bring some sort of action to enforce government targets, either under statute or human rights or constitutional claims. So if we think, for example, about the recent Neubauer decision in Germany, holding that the German federal government has a procedural duty to specify reductions beyond the year 2030 consistent with the Paris Agreement, establishing a procedural duty to kind of spell out how they're going to essentially achieve net zero. Or similarly, the Urgenda case out of the Netherlands suggesting a substantive duty, right, holding that the government had a substantive duty to do its fair share to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, in that case specific to 2020, but one can imagine applying a similar logic to interim as well as ultimate net zero targets. Finally, I want to turn to net zero target design and the need to distinguish carbon mitigation, that is goals that are specific to emissions reduction, and goals for carbon removal. So net zero targets largely assume the fungibility of carbon mitigation and carbon removal. Indeed, the Paris Agreement calls for a balance between emissions by sources and removals by sinks. But there are reasons for caution in treating carbon mitigation and carbon removal as equivalent. These include accounting or verifiability concerns. With respect to reducing carbon emissions, for the most part, carbon accounting for that is pretty straightforward. If you think about, okay, we've reduced the amount of fossil fuels combusted, it's pretty easy to calculate that. Less easy to account for carbon removal if we think about techniques of nature-based carbon removal, such as forestation. Figuring out exactly the net carbon removal is not always as straightforward. Similar concerns regarding permanence, that is, nature-based carbon removal in particular, raises serious concerns about impermanence. Are these forests, they're not going to last forever. If they burn, the carbon goes back into the atmosphere. We don't have those sorts of impermanence concerns with respect to carbon mitigation, to the extent that once you decided, okay, we've reduced the carbon emissions, there's no possibility of escape of those emissions, in contrast to carbon removal. Technological maturity, as I suggested earlier, engineered carbon removal, which offers the greatest potential in terms of the scale of carbon removal that we're going to need. Those techniques tend to be those that are least mature. They're not ready. They're extremely expensive at this point. There's a lot of work that needs to be done before we can actually count on them. And yet, at the same time, we can imagine net zero pledges kind of banking on some of these techniques without our assurance that they're actually going to work out. There's also variability in terms of risks. And then finally, I wanted to note the concern about moral hazard or mitigation deterrence. That is the possibility that the more we engage in carbon removal activities, that might undermine efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This wouldn't be a problem if carbon mitigation and carbon removal were equivalent, but these reasons on the slide suggest that they aren't going to be equivalent. And there's a concern that the more we engage in carbon removal now, that might delay transformative changes in energy systems. Substituting carbon removal for carbon mitigation can shift the burden either to future generations or to the global south. And it turns out that we're probably going to need a lot of both, right, to achieve net zero. So we shouldn't really be thinking about substituting one for the other. So setting distinct targets for emissions reduction and carbon removal will reduce the risk of substituting future or even present day carbon removal for carbon mitigation, and direct resources to developing the carbon removal techniques that will have sufficient scale. Ultimately, net zero targets could play an important role in battling climate change. Declaring the targets is easy. Implementing the targets and holding governments and private actors responsible for meeting them is harder but essential. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Albert. And then next we have Tade.
Thank you, Mariana. Okay, thank you, Carolina and Mariana, for putting this together, and to the other speakers as well for the very enlightening and engaging discussion already. Lynn already touched on so many issues that ties perfectly into what I'm going to be speaking about as well. And my talk is going to focus on the role of law and policy in enhancing technology-based solutions for energy decarbonization. The last speaker already spoke about a lot about how and to what extent can net zero pledges and all of that be achieved. And one, to the extent in which energy systems plays a big role in in the carbon intensity of economies globally. Then, of course, technology-based solutions to energy decarbonization is absolutely critical to achieving net zero pledges and all the other objectives under the Paris Agreement and subsequent agreements to tackle climate change. I'm going to be talking a little bit about background papers soon, but the topic leans on or builds on some of the a couple of research projects that I've been engaging in a couple of in recent times, which focuses on how and to what extent law and regulation plays a role in decarbonization for countries or economies that are traditionally reliant on hydrocarbons and seeking to transition into more sustainable energy pathways. Now, there are several technologies that can help to facilitate or integrate more cleaner fuels or more cleaner resources like renewables and hydrogen into existing networks. And one of those is the power to gas option to develop energy that probably would or otherwise be curtailed or not be able to be used when demand goes down because of the nature of most of the frontline renewable energy technologies like solar and wind. And that energy could be taken and converted into hydrogen, for example, or even other renewable energy fuels. And another technology which already is discussed here today is carbon capture and storage and carbon removal technologies. Now, of course, international law plays a big role in how things will play out and how this commercialization and scalability of these technologies have either been slowed down over the years or not really got into their full potentials. And I'm going to try to highlight some of those issues that I think are going to be important in the days to come. So the two main papers that I was referring to earlier on is the chapter in the decarbonization energy industry handbook that talks about power to gas and technology-based solutions, and the other one, a paper in the Pace Environmental Law Review that focused on New York's emerging climate and energy policy, and another further reading on CCS technology is the chapter in Carolina's handbook. Actually, she co-edited this handbook, and another one by the Global CCS Institute. Now, the three background thoughts that informed or that underpins some of the findings relevant to what I'll be talking about is, one, assessing the legal and policy frameworks for energy decarbonization requires a contextual approach. One, it's important to understand the energy context, the energy system that policymakers are trying to decarbonize or transition to more sustainable pathways, and also the socioeconomic context in which this is going to take place. For example, the energy policy and sustainability challenges in New York is going to be different from the sustainability and energy challenges in Cairo, Egypt, for example. So understanding the context and how law at the local, regional, and international level can help facilitate the objectives is always going to be important. And another issue is that institutions play a very critical role, instrumental role in facilitating some of these pledges and ensuring transparency, ensuring accountability, and ensuring that there is an effective way of reaching the objectives. And in an energy context, it's important to also kind of understand how it's important to ensure resilient energy systems, reliable systems, and also affordability as the trajectory or as the development towards net zero pathways is being developed. Now, just briefly, the IPCC report underscores some of these issues about what options are there to mitigate or to deal with the climate change challenge and reach the ideal targets for net zero. It includes technologies like hydrogen, CCS, carbon dioxide removal, and all that. And even the recent reports by NASEM, the National Academics of Science and Engineering, that focus on accelerating decarbonization in the US also speaks to the importance of ensuring technology-based solutions are cost-effective and cost-efficient, and how it is important to have an integrated approach, a comprehensive approach. So rather than focusing on substituting, for example, like what Lynn was talking about, substituting carbon removal options for direct mitigation options, there should be a comprehensive approach that targets or that is fit for purpose, basically. So the big question in all of this is, to what extent will law and policy frameworks create the necessary incentives and regulatory environments? And we all, most of us already, I'm sure we are all familiar with this slide from the US EPA. It talks about the sources of greenhouse gas emissions in terms of the sectors. In the US at 2019, you can see that transportation accounts for about 29%, electricity, of course, accounts for 25%, and industry. Now, all this we can all say is due to the kind of composition of the energy systems involved in these sectors, right? And carbon dioxide is the main source is the main pollutant, is the main problem here. And this chart speaks to the primary sources of energy, like I was saying earlier on, and also the sectors on the right, the sectors where these primary sources of energy are delivered to. And we can see also it connects to the earlier slide that speaks about the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation is very high on the list because a lot of petroleum resources goes into transportation, most of it, but very little of petroleum goes into electricity. And natural gas plays a big role, of course, in electricity. And over the years, to the extent in which coal has been reduced and there's been a switching from coal to more natural gas, there's been a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the electricity sector in the US. And so that brings up a question of, in the future, as the trajectory towards net zero grows and becomes more becomes more essential and critical, will technologies like natural gas with CCUS, will they become more important as well, equally important as well? And also, if you're going to electrify, for example, there's a lot of discussion about electrifying things and electrifying everything. If you electrified all the sectors, or transportation, for example, as it is right now, what that simply means is a lot of more capacity demand is going to be placed on the electricity sector. And if the grid is not reliable or resilient enough to manage that capacity demand, there's going to be a lot of problems with things like congestion and balance, which are technical and systemic issues. And also another thing that would happen is the supply of primary resources that will be required to meet that upshoot or for a quadruple increase in capacity demand will most likely come from some of these other sources. So if investments and developments of cleaner, sustainable, more sustainable technologies doesn't meet up with the demand, additional demand and existing demand for energy in the electricity sector, then there's going to be the question of, are we really going to be able to attain some of these net zero pledges that is being we've been talking about? So understanding the context is always going to be important. And in an international sense, this chart talks about the US, but if one digs deeper, most of the industrialized countries will have a similar problem and a similar, somewhat similar challenge in reaching net zero and solving all the issues of being able to facilitate the right technologies and the right cluster of solutions to deal with the challenge. So which is why it's important to see options such as how to develop more renewable energy systems, but in order to deal with the challenges that those systems bring to the networks, like things like resiliency, reliability, and the need for storage because of the variableness of some of the frontline resources, then it might be important to factor in the development of technologies like power to gas systems, and also a way to effectively and efficiently integrate the increase in variable resources in the networks. And that's what this power to gas option provides. And there's a lot of discussion about this in several countries, especially in the EU. The Germans have done a lot of work on renewable energy and clean hydrogen production from power to gas systems. And there's a lot of discussion, for example, there's an European hydrogen policy. And also countries like Morocco and in Algeria, they're partnering with the International Renewable Energy Agency to develop some such systems. And hydrogen is not necessarily a new energy source or energy carrier. It's been used for space activities in NASA for a long time. NREL is developing fuel cell hydrogen systems for vehicles, and trains can be used for trains and the hard to decarbonize or electrify sectors like industry. So there is a role to play for systems like that, but the question is, to what extent is the existing frameworks able to facilitate timely development and competitiveness of these resources? So this chart I won't have time to go into this chart, but it shows how in the United States context, for example, how investment and development of these technologies will interact with it from the regulatory and contractual standpoint. And assuming someone wants to invest in a power to gas or hydrogen development facility and has a lot of renewable energy investments, it will have to, if it's going to develop that for an interstate project, it will have to deal with the wholesale markets, and the regulators will be FERC, and to supply the interstate market. So it could also be the intrastate, a system designed to feed into the intrastate systems. And so understanding the context is always going to be important, and how to provide the right incentives for these projects. I think I can stop here.
Tade, this is super interesting, and everyone else, but we are running a little bit short of time, and I also want to have time for people to ask questions. So if you could maybe wrap up, that would be great.
Yes, I'm done. So.
Oh, you're done, you said?
Yes. I was just wrapping up when you.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So yeah, I thought you said I'm doing it. So anyway, sorry about that. So yeah, very interesting stuff. And sorry about my somewhat unelegant comment right there. But thank you. Super interesting stuff. And as I said, I want to make sure that people have time to ask questions also. So I'm going to forego my own presentation, which is fine. I'll just put this one up here then real quickly, noting that I will not be in full-time academia after New Year's. I will be with something called the Einstrong Foundation, as I said, working full-time on climate change law and policy from a private point of view. And then just really briefly, while people can start sending me questions in the chat function, noting that as we have noted, there's of course the Glasgow conference coming up in just a couple of days from now. And as you might have seen in the national or international media, our domestic agenda is still only half baked, as the media says right now, just a few days before Glasgow. The most significant points of contention seem to be the Democratic side's hope for investments in climate change programs and reinvestment in electricity programs and so on and so forth. So just very briefly, and this is political, as unfortunately this issue is seen to be in many parts of the nation or in this country in general. So I think the Democratic Party could easily agree if they, yes, I do count myself as a Democrat, I will say, could agree on taking more action in this area. But the Republican Party sees this differently, as of course they're entitled to do. So if you notice, a lot of Republicans, almost 60% of them do not consider climate change to be important at all. And another 32% think it's only one of several important concerns. So hence this American-based, I think this is Pew Science Center just recently, this American-based frustration, and why the rest of the world or other parts of the world don't see us as taking enough action. And that is unfortunately because this has become so politicized and so recalcitrant of an issue that one of the two major parties simply doesn't see this as being that important at all. Noting also maybe the only hope is that younger generations and younger Republicans are maybe a little more likely to say that too little is being done about climate change. So unfortunately, here's still a lot of political debate that I don't really see a solution to. So maybe, as some of the other panelists have mentioned, a solution might not actually come from the regulatory or federal levels or even state levels, but simply through private level actions, such as that, investments and what other things I will be working on privately, but also civil lawsuits against corporations in a variety of fields. And just again, because we're running out of time, I will be working on a potential suit for a California-based organization called Advocates for the Environment, with a potential claim under the Alien Tort Statute, which might not succeed. In fact, it's unlikely to succeed, but again, private action and litigation may be our best hope for this. So with that, that is enough from me. So I will now take questions from the audience, and let me just shift out here to take some questions. And I'm also going to post shortly here a slide announcing how you can get your CLE credits for this. So let me open that up. And if you have any questions, please start typing them in. I think there are some in the chat room. I simply need to give you your codes for the CLE credit, and noting that you need to write this down. This code right now, it will not be available after we're done here today. So write this down. You can't get CLE credit without the code, and this code will not be given to you after the event. I've been informed and to tell you. So now you're warned about that. So please write this down as you can see it. And let me shift my screens again here and go back out to see if there's any questions. Let me just see if there's any questions. Perhaps Carolina, can you see any? Because I'm having a little bit of a technical issue here. If you could see the chat room and start taking questions. Oh, I see them right now. So let me see. There was an announcement about another energy panel later on. So anyway, so I don't really see, question for Charlotte, I do see that. With respect to the US military, are their climate-related activities more focused on adaptation than mitigation?
Yes, so they have very very extensive building plans, Corps of Engineers. These are huge interagency undertakings to try to shore up facilities as well as to relocate them in ways that would allow activities to continue. It's really quite amazing. I mean, that's sort of at the ground level. At the higher level, the subject of climate change and its implications has been actually part of, I think, almost every national security strategy since 1991. So it's been certainly flagged as a potential force multiplier and something that needs to be addressed. But on the more sort of adaptive work, there's quite extensive undertakings by those in charge of maintaining military facilities and building them, not only physical assets, but also just the transportation and related kinds of operational issues.
Great. And again, if you cannot see the slide that I have up in the background, the CLE code that you need to write down if you want credit for this is 558068. I don't see any other questions typed into the chat room, so I'd like to circle back to Tadej to see if then we have a few more minutes. You could maybe once again touch on what you see as the conclusion or your solution to all of this.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Mariana. I just think from a legal standpoint, from a legal and policy standpoint, it's important to be able to identify where law can provide the right incentives for timely investments in all the massive technology solutions and even nature-based solutions that will be required to get us to all these net zero pledges that both corporations and institutions and governments are making. Because without that, it will just all it will be very difficult to. For example, in terms of CCUS and carbon removal technologies, one of the things that would help, for example, is that has helped recently, for example, is an amendment to the London Protocol that allows when you capture CO2 in a particular, for example, in a particular production facility in North Sea, you can transport it across across the sea through the territorial sea and the areas in which the London Protocol covers. So ability to transport CO2, store CO2 safely and securely, and make sure that the long-term and medium-term liability and risks that might arise is properly understood and allocated. For example, is another important issue. And in a country like the US, for example, we have I think consideration of, for example, who owns pore spaces on private land and also on public federal land still being debated on several fronts. And so having a clear policy on how these things will be done, I think will go a long way in helping.
Great. So let me see. I don't see any other questions. So again, with that, we're almost at the end. The CLE credit is now displayed on your screen. And let me also remind you that coming up a little bit later at 3:30 to 4:45 p.m. Eastern Time, there's an investment law and the future of international energy governance panel you might want to look at. And that also there's a networking room from 4:45 to 5:30 p.m. today. And I have set out the link earlier. There's a networking session, including one for us in the international environmental and energy laws subsection. So with that, let me see if there's any more comments. I don't see any. So thank you so very much to all the distinguished panelists and speakers. Thank you much. It's been an honor to be here this year. Thanks to ABILA for hosting us and squeezing us in. Climate change is arguably the most important international law problem we have. So let's hope we find some solutions to it. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.